Hello and welcome to my home. I'm Tom Maddock, a retired clergy person from the Desert Southwest Annual Conference and our Conference Disaster Response Coordinator. Like you, for the past several months, I've been at home trying not to contribute to the spread of the coronavirus. And like you, I've been worshiping, learning, fellowshipping, and meeting remotely. This pattern will continue for a season, but now is the time to begin preparing for the return of people to your church campus. You are required by the bishop to form a team and create a detailed plan for reopening your facilities. This plan will be submitted to your district superintendent for review and approval before you can reopen. This presentation, along with the checklist for churches found on our conference website, will provide you with some of the essentials you need to consider in writing your plan based on CDC recommendations and other best practices. As you know, the available information and guidelines are continually changing as more is discovered about the spread of the virus. Continue to refer back to the CDC website at cdc.gov under the tab labeled Faith-Based Organizations. Additional resources and updates will be on our conference website. In your preparation, it is essential that you comply with all state and local regulations concerning the opening of worship spaces. Our purpose is to create a safe and welcoming place so people are comfortable returning. When they return, it will not be as it was before. You need to inform them of these changes. The recommendations here may seem restrictive and even disruptive to the flow to which people are accustomed. People are not returning to what once was, but perhaps something better. It's time for the creativity you've applied to remotely worship and fellowship and learn and carry that into the resumption of your in-person worship. I'd like to begin with a brief meditation. This is a familiar passage from Matthew's Gospel. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty, and you gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." I believe this passage to be foundational to our work in preparing to reopen our facilities. Who are the least of these who may come to our doors? Of course, there are the ones who are more elderly and have physical conditions that make it difficult to fight off infections. We need to be prepared for them. We need to care for the least of these. And in caring for the least of these, we are also caring for ourselves. It is as though we are doing it for Jesus himself. Let's now look at some of the topics I'll be covering in this presentation that will help you in getting ready to host people once again in your facilities. The first is you have to get your building ready. This is going to include, but not be limited to, disinfecting all the surfaces where people might touch and contract the virus. Also, you need a plan for how people will enter into your facility and how they can exit. That needs to be a controlled process. I'll also be looking at how do you prepare your offices? What is your worship experience going to look like? What about Sunday school and nursery care facilities? What possibly new requirements are you going to have for small groups, like 12-step groups that may share your facilities? And also, how do you communicate all of this with your people to prepare them for a changed paradigm? Let's consider some general guidelines. The first and most important is that you must, as a congregation, comply with all your state and local standards. This is essential and cannot be overlooked. You need to familiarize yourself with those guidelines and standards and make sure they are a part of your plan. If you share your facilities with another organization, whether it's another worshiping community or an outside group, all of those groups must comply with your approved standards. I'd really recommend putting together a document of understanding that states what your expectations are of that group as far as use, maintaining spatial separation from each other, and cleaning up the facility after they use it. One perhaps overlooked issue is what protocol will you have if someone contracts the virus who has attended your worship or a small group? Will you have a reporting system in place? And realize if someone self-identifies and self-reports, that cannot be published or given notice in a public setting if you identify that individual. And then getting back to my meditation, think of the elderly. Think of those who have medical conditions that could compromise their health if they were exposed to the virus. How will you be caring for them? Let's now look at how you clean your spaces. My first recommendation is that you go to the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, and look at their recommendations. Their website is on the slide. You need to wear masks and gloves using EPA-approved disinfectants. The first line of defense in cleaning is using soap and water. You may want to make a solution of bleach and water using the formula of 1/3 cup bleach to a gallon of water. Other than that, be very cautious about not mixing bleach and ammonia. It can create toxic fumes that could harm your lungs. When you are disinfecting places and spaces that children will be, or toys and other surfaces used by children, don't use disinfectants. Some of them will be toxic. Read the labels. It is recommended by the CDC that you disinfect those areas using just soap and water. If you need to clean porous surfaces or soft surfaces, just use soap and water or a recommended product for, let's say, upholstery. As you clean, give special attention to these areas: tables, doorknobs, light switches, handles, cleaning phones, office equipment. You have to be very intentional in keeping your restrooms clean. That will be one area where contamination can more easily happen. Also think about when you use the pulpit, the lectern, the altar, those types of things, they all need cleaning, including musical instruments used in worship. In preparing your worship space for gathering people once again, as well as your classrooms, remove hymnals, Bibles, registration pads, pens, and other things that you may keep in the back of your pews or chairs. We do not want any cross-contamination by someone picking up a hymnal, putting it back, and then another person using it. In common areas, turn off the drinking fountains and cover them up. Again, this is a place where the virus can be transferred. Also, in those common areas, if you have the upper room, pamphlets about the church, or any type of material, printed material, remove it from the displays. Again, it is too easy if someone touches that surface or that pamphlet, picks it up, that the next piece could be contaminated. And here's a good idea. Provide signage throughout your buildings as reminders to maintain spatial distancing of at least 6 feet or more, to wash hands, to cover coughs, to wear masks. All those things will be critical to us preventing the spread of the virus. CDC already has prepared those signs in 8.5 by 11 and 11 by 17 formats that you can print off. The address is on the slide. Now, how do people get into the building? You're going to need to have control over the entry points. One, so you can keep the handles and the like clean. It's actually recommended that if you have an entrance and can prop it open and keep it open, that's best, so that no one's handling that door handle or doorknob. But you need to control how people get into the building, limiting that access. You want to limit that access so that you can monitor that people are wearing face masks. That's going to be one of the requirements that you have, that every person attending worship has a face mask. You may also want to provide hand sanitizer there for everyone. So as they walk in, they hold out their hands, you squirt the hand sanitizer in, and they rub it together in their hands. And you also need to have an accurate count of the number of people entering the facility. When you are counting and you get close to the maximum capacity, which has not yet been determined for our congregations, you need to remember that you may already have the pastor, a musician, sound person, and others on staff that have to be a part of that number. Realize when we talk about entrances, those often are our exits. But we need to assure that every exit that is marked with an exit sign must, by fire code, remain a point of egress. In no way limit the ability of people to exit your building in the event of an emergency. Let's turn our attention now to preparing your offices. That may be one of the first spaces that you reopen. There needs to be a disinfection process for all of the office surfaces, particularly shared equipment, copiers, printers, computers. It's not recommended that you even use coffee machines or refrigerators or microwaves, but if you do, please disinfect the handles and the surfaces between each person using those. You need to limit contact with each other in the office and maintain that spatial distancing of at least 6 feet. It's also recommended that you limit the contact with the staff by outside people. If possible, continue working from home. And always, even with those who come into the office, assure that they are wearing a mask and that they are keeping at least 6 feet of distance. You will be told when you can reopen your offices. Now let's turn our attention to our worship spaces. It's obvious that a lot of people are looking forward to getting back into their sanctuaries and again experiencing the joy of being together and worshiping God. But it's going to be different. It has to be different. Part of that difference will be that we cannot put as many people in that space as we had previously. The number of people that will be allowed to worship at one time together in your worship space is yet to be determined. There are many guidelines already out there. However, our conference has not yet approved what that number will be. Will it be a percentage of capacity according to fire code? Will it be a number less than 50 or less than 100? That is yet to be determined. But in preparation, you need to look at your worship space and begin visualizing and perhaps even marking off spaces where people can sit and others that need to be left vacant. That's allowing for that 6-foot separation. You might even consider creating a seating chart. You may want to designate seating areas for families with children. You may want to have another area for the senior population in your congregation, all the while being mindful of that 6-foot separation. Now, as people come into the building and are greeted, we need to train our greeters not to touch. And by the way, they won't be handing out bulletins either. There are to be no bulletins handed out. This means that everything will either need to be projected on a screen for people to read or announced by the worship leaders. Another significant change that people are going to notice is the music. There will be no choirs. All music will need to be pre-recorded or live instrumental music. Significant as well is at this time, wearing masks and trying to protect people, there is no congregational singing. The problem is that with standard masks, particles and droplets can penetrate and go through those masks. Again, it's not what we would want, it's not what people hoped for, but is what is necessary at this time. For the very same reason that we're not going to do congregational singing, we're also not going to do congregational responses in worship. So there'll be no responsive call to worship or unison prayers and those things that are usually part of our ritual. Again, we put people at risk if we have a number of people speaking, even if it's through masks. One of the things that we also do during worship is we have the registration of attendance. That's important for us to understand who is worshiping with us, if they have any special needs or prayer concerns, but there will be no registration pads in the pews. There are several alternatives that you can consider. One would be having persons upon entering sign a separate piece of paper with their name, address, and information and drop it into a plate or a box. That would require, though, that you have individual Gulf pencils that you give to the person or that you use pens that can be wiped down. It's always better to give it to them and let them take it rather than having to try and sanitize those items. Another alternative is having some kind of computer registration. So rather than signing a paper, the person is asked, "Can you please tell me your name and give me your address?" if they're not recognized, and that's entered into a database. Be creative. There are ways to take attendance while yet preserving the integrity and safety of people who are attending. As we are not passing registration pads any longer, we also need to be aware that we're not going to pass an offering plate. There's too much risk in that. We suggest that you put an offering plate or a slotted box near the exit, and as people leave, they are encouraged to leave their offering there. One fail-safe method, of course, is to promote online giving and get more of your congregation to use that on a regular basis. Or as my wife and I do, have a weekly debit from our checking account covering our offering and other special gifts that we make to the church. Another custom of many churches is the passing of the peace. We're not shaking hands. That's obvious. So perhaps we just verbally recognize others around us? Or even, what about a new practice that we simply put our hands in a prayerful attitude before us and bow to each other without needing to speak a word? Here again is an opportunity for creativity as you prepare to worship. And now for communion. Again, you can already imagine the risks associated with a common loaf and a common cup. There can be none at this time. One possibility would be that you have the pastor consecrate the elements without distributing them, and vicariously through the actions and words of the pastor, the congregants receive the sacrament. Another solution might be available through many vendors are individual communion kits. They have a wafer as well as the juice. You need to decide if you want to use these, or again, be creative and come up with ways in which you can share in that sacrament according to your church's practice and tradition. A fellowship time is a time when we used to be able to talk with people and catch up with each other. We're not encouraging that. Yes, talk. Maybe have a space set aside outside where people can keep distance from each other and talk to each other. But we need to be aware that right now, no beverages or refreshments can be served. Eventually, in later phases, when we do have the provision for beverages, it's suggested that an individual with proper personal protective equipment, gloves, and a mask serve people. And we use only commercially packaged individual servings of refreshments. Again, this mitigates some of the possibility of cross-contamination with multiple people touching a pot handle, water pitcher, or more particularly, cookies on a platter. As in many of our sanctuaries, sound equipment is necessary. We recommend that a microphone, a designated microphone, be given to each person who will be speaking. Do not share a common microphone. Following worship, those need to be disinfected. And in speaking of disinfection, after every worship time, between services, if you have more than one, you need to disinfect all surfaces that were touched. Also, empty the trash containers. And those who are doing the work, again, need to wear gloves as well as masks. We don't want any of them getting sick, trying to take care of us. Now let's turn our attention to our Sunday school rooms. First, note that there is no Sunday school or child care in this first phase once we get back into our buildings. That will have to come at a later date. All children will need to be with their parents in worship. Once we are able to reopen our Sunday school rooms and programs, we need to be sure that we have personal protective equipment for our teachers. At minimum, a mask. If they're changing diapers, definitely have gloves and always sanitizer. I would suggest that in every classroom, the symptoms for COVID-19 be posted. Again, that poster is available from the CDC. It will be a quick reference if a teacher suspects that one of the children are getting sick. Try to plan a protocol for how children are dropped off and picked up. I would be sure to have teachers who are welcoming the children Ask if the children have had any symptoms at all. Stuffy nose, cough, sneezes, whatever it might be. They have to be transparent with the teachers. Also, make sure that the parents keep spatial distancing from each other. We don't want them all in a row or all packed around the door. One of the most difficult things in our Sunday school rooms will be maintaining spatial separation with the children. Children by nature get together, they want to play together. So how do we keep them separated from each other? Teachers are going to have to be creative and find clever ways of teaching the children about the virus without necessarily naming it, but the importance of keeping space between each other. You may want to consider reducing the size and limiting the size of the class and using a couple of rooms with smaller groups than one larger room with a larger number of children. If curriculum is used, anything printed, anything that might be shared, limit that. Again, that becomes a vehicle by which the virus may be transmitted. If pencils or pens or markers are used, make sure that they are something that can be disinfected after use and that they just not be thrown back into a common bin where you cannot tell the difference between what was used and what was not used. Those writing instruments will need to be disinfected. For the protection of our children, one other measure would be that if a child is ill, that the parents inform the church office. We cannot disclose who that child is, only that on a particular occasion, on this day, a child was present and there may have been an exposure to the COVID virus. Like our Sunday school rooms, the nursery requires special attention. Here again, we want the staff to have masks and gloves. This is particularly important if they're changing diapers or clothing. They need some layer of protection also when they're comforting a crying child. Nursery needs to be limited to children who are 2 years of age and older. A child 2 or younger cannot wear a protective mask, which we recommend for the children who are in Sunday school. There needs to be an adequate process to dispose of diapers and wipes, as well as a means to sanitize the changing station after each use. Many of you have small groups that meet in your facilities. Tentatively, the maximum number of persons in a group is to be 10 or fewer, or as local code would require. You need to have adequate spacing for those persons to keep spatial distancing. And it is suggested that these groups, if possible, continue to make online connections and support each other remotely. In the rooms, there is to be no food or beverages, again, for the possibility of cross-contamination. And once the group is done with the room, they need to clean all of the surfaces. If an outside group is using your facility, again, they must comply with all of your regulations and stipulations for how the room is to be cleaned and sanitized after their use. I know this is a lot to digest. One of the most important things, though, that you need to do is to come up with a plan on how you are going to communicate with your people all the changes that they can expect. They need to know that there's going to be limited seating. There's going to be checkpoints at each entrance. They're not going to be able to sit as close as they once were, and worship is not going to appear as it did before. They also need to know that there's an expectation that they wear a mask. But above all, They need to be assured that the facilities and practices that you are putting in place are for their safety as well as the safety of others. I hope that this presentation has provided you with some guidance and perhaps even some inspiration as you prepare to reconstitute and open your buildings once again for worship, learning, meetings, and fellowship. We all look forward to that time. Know that the bishops, superintendents, and I are praying for divine wisdom in the timing of the reopening of your facilities. Pray along with us, please. And together we will enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise.